Southampton honours the GIs when the 14th Major Port of the Transportation Corps were granted the right to make a ceremonial march through the town. The inevitable dog mascot was there, of course, to see the mayor hand over the scroll commemorating the event. A closing chapter in the history of an organisation that embarked 2 million men from Southampton to the continent between D-Day and VE Day.
According to the U.S. Army history, in the spring of 1942 the Transportation Corps' functions and authority were in the formative stage. There was no large pool of officers experienced in transportation matters and no doctrine covering the Corps' responsibilities overseas. A pioneer among overseas theatre organizations, the Transportation Corps in Britain had to gain recognition within the theatre and assume authority over transportation activities formerly handled by the Quartermaster Corps and the Corps of Engineers. Within the theatre services of supply, the Transportation Corps authority had to be decided vis-à-vis territorial base section commands. Moreover, relations had to be worked out with British transportation agencies by an evolutionary process. A Transportation Corps had to grow from a small handful of officers and enlisted men into an effective organization against a shifting strategic background. U.S. military observers were sent to Britain in 1940, and in the following year Congress enacted legislation extending Lend-Lease aid to the British. Joint staff discussions between American and British military authorities were initiated early in 1941. At these meetings the decision was made that should the United States become involved in the war, the major emphasis would first be placed on the defeat of Germany. Southampton was to become the principal U.S. port, in peacetime a thriving passenger port and a familiar gateway for visitors to the British Isles. It had suffered severely from enemy bombing in 1940. As a result, the port had remained idle for some time, yet despite the considerable damage Southampton remained one of the best ports in England, with ample deep water and a relatively small tidal range allowing ships to berth at almost any time of the day. There were also 7 graving docks for ship repairs and over 7 miles of quayside. To British officials the port seemed too vulnerable to be used as a base for operations, but to American eyes was ideal for the Armada. After Dunkirk the port was closed to all commercial traffic and the quayside remained desolate for almost 2 years. Yet on the 26th of January, 1943 the docks were notified of the impending arrival of 3 ocean-going steamers carrying timber, foodstuffs and mixed consignments. On the 6th of February the first Lend-Lease vessels arrived, and on the 2nd 36,683 tons were discharged. On the 13th of April there was a record tonnage for a single day of 4,000 tons, and 5,000 tons the following day. Later in the month the dock manager's diary records that the port continued to make good progress and the proposal to send these ships to Southampton fully justified. A little under a month later the docks were virtually working to full capacity. The incremental approach adopted by the U.S. Army vindicated the decision to reopen the port in the summer of 1943. According to the memoirs of the U.S. Army adjutant to the port commander, when the 14th port first arrived in Southampton, they took over the maritime chambers in Canute Road. There was initially a complement of 24 officers representing 10 branches of the Army and approximately 130 enlisted men. Their aim was twofold: firstly to expedite the turnaround time of Liberty ships and delivery of their cargo of tanks, trucks and munitions to the storage area on Salisbury Plain. This was to be achieved with the cooperation of British stevedores, and secondly to prepare for the port of Southampton to become the focal point for American and British forces. Ports to the east of Southampton were for the sole use of British and Commonwealth forces, and ports to the west were to be operated by the Americans. US and British troops were largely kept separate in World War II to manage logistical differences, cultural tensions, and operational efficiency. Command was integrated at high levels, but ground forces operated in distinct geographical sectors. Southampton was the exception, as the dock facilities were to be used jointly for the build-up of US as well as UK troops and vehicles. Early in May, a month before D-Day, Southampton and its litter of subports became the focus in the preparation for the great outbound movement to the continent. These subports, operated by the 14th port with headquarters at Southampton, included Portland, Weymouth, Truro, Plymouth, Falmouth, Dartmouth, Hale, Totnes, Hamble, and Poole. When the invasion was postponed from the 5th to the 6th of June, although the British temporarily halted their troop flow because of the scale of the operation and a lack of communications, the Americans continued to move units from concentration areas to marshalling camps and embarkation points. This led to the first signs of congestion as Southampton was crowded with columns of U.S. troops and long convoys of vehicles, tanks and other material. At the outset the port experienced a serious shortage of personnel and there was not enough vessels to lift all the forces moving into the port area. The weeks that followed was attended by congestion, confusion and a temporary loss of control of the sea-mounting machinery. In the first few days movement from the transit camps conformed to the U.S. First Army's build-up priority tables, but thereafter the tactical situation dictated frequent changes. At Southampton, loading tables issued by sector headquarters before the arrival of troops proved erroneous, so that all planning and loading had to be effected after the units had arrived and after the actual number of troops and vehicles could be determined. To overcome the problem, on the 9th of June, BUCO, the Build-Up and Control Organization, ordered the loading of units on vessels as rapidly as possible regardless of priority and directed the temporary curtailment of movements into the marshalling camps behind Southampton. Units were then moved into embarkation points and loaded onto ships and craft as rapidly as they became available. Embarkation was accomplished on short notice and often without the benefit even of hurriedly prepared plans. In some cases no records were kept of these loadings. Outloadings of personnel and vehicles reached a peak in July 1944 and continued at its busiest through September. During this period there was some simplification of organization and procedures in the Southern Bay section. One change was that marshalling Area C, which funneled units into Southampton, was turned over to the 14th Port. Between June 6 and May 8 Southampton handled approximately 8,000 vessels. All the subports, together with Southampton, handled slightly over 9,500 ships. Over an 11-month period, the 14th Port handled almost 28 ships a day. Weymouth loaded 2,100 landing ship tanks and 1,500 landing craft tanks. Southampton loaded 1,500 landing ship tanks, 1,700 landing craft tanks, and 1,070 motor transport ships. Throughout this period the port facilities were shared by the Americans and the British on a day-to-day allocation made in accordance with the tactical needs. In recognition of his service at Southampton and his involvement in the cross-channel landings in France, Colonel Mayer of the U.S. Army Transportation Corps was awarded the Order of the British Empire, the OBE. Colonel Kaiser, also based at Southampton, was awarded the CB. According to his citation, during the build-up, when both nations often used the same marshalling and transit camps and the greatest coordination was necessary, the liaison and cooperation between the British and American forces in the Southampton area was excellent to a very large extent due to the personal efforts of Colonel Kaiser. The phrase overpaid, overdressed, oversexed and overhere was often applied by Allied troops to U.S. GIs. However, the task of planning and directing U.S. forces in the United Kingdom was assumed by a young and inexperienced transportation corps with no large pool of experienced officers and no doctrine covering the core responsibilities overseas. Yet these Americans, with their headquarters in Southampton Civic Center, handled 60% of all American troops and equipment shipped to Normandy, and over 2 million American troops passed through the port. On the 14th of March, 1946, the 14th major port of the U.S. Army Transportation Corps was honored by the mayor and town with the freedom of Southampton, allowing them to march through the town with bayonets fixed, drums beating and colors flying.
And now, with full honors, the march begins. Bayonets fixed, drums beating and colors flying.